What? Tigers? Shut up. They don't have tigers in Africa. That's lions. The tigers live in, like, India and Southeast Asia. What? Not that kind of tigers. What other kind of... Huh? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I got it. Okay, yeah. Well, January 22nd, 1943. The Germans have been beaten in battle several times this war, and they've even had large units surrounded, but they've never had an entrenched formation completely annihilated. Well, not until this week at Veliki Luki. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week on Guadalcanal, the Americans launched another large offensive to finally clear the Japanese from the island, unaware that the Japanese already plan on soon evacuating it. The Casablanca Conference began, which is about the Allied plans for 1943. The Soviets broke into the siege of Leningrad so it can be at least somewhat better supplied, and they continued their advances in the Caucasus and along the Don, and even launched new offensives against the Hungarians and the Italians, routing them both by the end of the week. The Axis are still surrounded as well at both Velikie Luki and Stalingrad. Operation Ring to clear the Stalingrad pocket began last week. Konstantin Rokossovsky's newest Don front attacks actually began already the 15th, though by that time, the Germans were already retreating to the planned final defensive positions from Borodkin till Alexeyevka. This was not an orderly withdrawal, though, since the cold, the snow, and Soviet artillery split it into skirmishes in some places, but into running retreats in others. Although Sixth Army tried to keep up with the rapidly changing situation, it could not. This left the retreating forces to fend for themselves as they struggled, sometimes in vain, to withdraw into more secure defensive positions. Paulus's army was unable to either contain the Soviet assaults or hold its planned intermediate defenses. Paulus is Friedrich Jose Paulus, commander of the encircled Sixth Army. But it's still not easy for the Soviets, partly because there are way more of the enemy than Operation Ring anticipated, but also because the defenses the enemy are falling back to are fortified positions built by the Red Army to defend Stalingrad last summer. On the other hand, of the nearly 200,000 Axis troops trapped a week ago, 60,000 or so have been lost by now, either killed, captured, or frozen to death. On the 16th and 17th, the Soviets grind forward, though much slower on the 17th. The 65th, 21st, and 57th Armies have advanced 22 kilometers in 5 days. The 24th and 64th Armies, 10 kilometers. They have taken Malaya and Pitomnik, both the town and the vital airfield. At the northeast of the pocket, Soviet 66th and 62nd Armies are hitting Karl Strecker's 11th Corps and in the city Walter von Seydlitz's 51st Corps, preventing them from reinforcing the troops trying to hold the west. By the end of the day, the 17th, a new Soviet 62nd Army offensive ordered by Vasily Chuikov has made a big increase to their bridgehead on the Volga. With Pitomnik gone and Gumrak under threat, Paulus has moved his headquarters back into the city itself. Even though German forces were bedraggled, worn out, and half-starved, they now occupied stronger defensive positions along the Orlovka, Gonchara, Peshanyi, and Starodubovka line, and gave no indication of ending their determined and often fanatical defense. Therefore, at Stavka's direction, Voronov and Rokossovsky worked out a new plan for the final reduction of the Stalingrad pocket. As they did so, they paused their general offensive for 4 days to allow their forces to rest, refit, and regroup, prior to the climax of the offensive, the final destruction of the dreaded beast that had tormented the Red Army for the past 7 months. So, there is a lull in the fighting in the city of Stalingrad for the next few days. Voronov and Rokossovsky submit their plans for the renewed offensive to Stavka early the morning of the 18th, and they are approved that afternoon. The main attacks are going to be from the west by the 24th, 65th, and 21st Armies, with Chistiakov's 21st as the spearhead, who is to reach Krasny Oktябr village after heading through Gumrak and splitting the enemy in two. That army is not just 9 rifle divisions, but they're also concentrating the Soviet artillery and armor. As Glantz writes, it's 40% of the whole front's artillery, 80% of the Guards mortar brigades, 41% of the tank regiments, and nearly 40% of the AA. They are not leaving a whole lot to chance. As for Paulus's Sixth Army, its troops tried to survive on dwindling, if not exhausted, rations. Its vehicles and few remaining tanks became immobile owing to the lack of fuel, and its guns and mortars fell silent due to the lack of ammunition. This big final attack is supposed to begin today at 11 a.m., but it does so already yesterday, with 24th, 65th, and 21st Armies making reconnaissance in force attacks. 24th and 65th just continue those attacks today to prevent the enemy from establishing new defenses or diverting force. This after a 70-minute artillery barrage. They do advance during the day from between 3 and 10 kilometers in various sectors of the front, and 21st Army reaches a point 2 kilometers west of Gumrak. But the week ends, and the enemy still fights, and the enemy still holds. But one place that does not hold is Veliki Luki. In fact, as the week gets going, German commander Eduard von Sass surrenders at 4 p.m. to troops of the Estonian 917th Rifle Regiment. That's in the east of the city. Those German forces in the citadel attempt a breakout after midnight the night before. 182 managed to reach German lines. Soviet forces capture the citadel and the rest just after sunrise the 16th. Stavka is critical of this victory, though. I mean, Soviet Third Shock Army did not take any of its other objectives, like Novosokolniki. Indeed, Veliki Luki looked like a Pyrrhic victory. Given Perkayev's earlier failure to capture Kholm and his front's concurrent defeat in Operation Mars, Perkayev was the obvious choice as the scapegoat for the Red Army's operational failures. This loss comes as a shock to the Wehrmacht, though. Well, it isn't just a loss. The entire German formation has been annihilated, and that is a first for this war. But the Wehrmacht is designed for short, sharp battles of movement, which require certain terrain and certain weather, and not ad hoc relief operations in frozen swamps. This battle's conclusion marks an important shift too. Up until now, and Stalingrad, if that city falls, Adolf Hitler's stand-fast tactics have worked. But now the Soviets have liquidated a well-prepared German garrison. If German commanders become reluctant to rely on just standing fast because of the events of this month, this could give the strategic initiative to the Soviets. And they are really on the move this week. The Voronezh and Southwestern Front, and the 18th Separate Rifle Corps attacks that began last week continue this week. And the Hungarian Second Army and the Italian Alpine Corps have been destroyed as fighting formations. On the 19th, the Soviets take Velikie and Urazovo. This Soviet campaign, this one, has already taken 50,000 POWs, but only some 2,500 of them are German. Down in the Caucasus, they're still advancing as well, taking Cherkessk the 19th, and the next day, forcing Army Group A back all along the line. Voroshilovsk is recaptured the 21st. The Axis are being pushed back this week as well in Papua New Guinea. On the 17th, the Australians penetrate Japanese Sanananda positions. The 19th, the Japanese order the withdrawal from Sanananda, and by the end of the week, Japanese resistance there is at an end. This is the end of Phase 1 of the Allied Joint Chiefs Directive from July 1942. And it is only 6 months behind schedule. Southwest Pacific Command issues news of the triumph, though Douglas MacArthur refers in the press to Allied troops or American troops, but hardly ever specifically to the Australians, who, to be fair, had, especially early in the campaign up and down the Kokoda track, borne the brunt of the fighting. MacArthur was now to assume overall command under the Joint Chiefs directive for the next stage of the drive to Rabaul, by advancing up the coast of New Guinea to the Huon Peninsula ports and undertaking operations against the Northern Solomons. This he intended to be the first step towards assuming supreme command of the war against Japan. But the Japanese are still on New Guinea further up the coast, and Emperor Hirohito tells Army Chief of Staff Hajime Sugiyama to not let Lai and Salamaua, where the Japanese are still established, become another Guadalcanal. So Rabaul sends 3,000 more men there with the task of heading inland and taking the Australian airstrip at Wau. As for Guadalcanal itself, on the 17th, the American Marines finished their drive to the beach. As for the Gifu, the well-fortified Japanese defense system on Mount Austin there, the Americans are broadcasting appeals over loudspeakers to the Japanese in the Gifu to surrender. 5 men do so the 17th. One later prisoner described how this appeal prompted an extraordinary episode. His company had a meeting where a general discussion produced a decision not to surrender because 80% or more of the unit was too ill to walk, and therefore the ambulatory members of the company believed their sick comrades would perish if the unit laid down its arms. Instead, they elected to die together. A huge artillery bombardment that day softens up the defenders even more, and attacks begin on the rear of the Gifu the 18th. Today, the 22nd, comes a breakthrough after engineers have finally made a trail through the jungle to the Gifu that a light tank can travel. It does, with a wedge of men behind it for support, destroying 8 pillboxes and creating a gap 200 meters wide for the support team to pour through and consolidate new front positions. I'm going to peer into the future here for a second. This devastating tank action does elicit a response. Tonight after midnight, a horde of desperate Japanese will rush the new line with pistols, rifles, and grenades, but most of them are slaughtered by machine gun fire within minutes, and by tomorrow evening, the Gifu is in American hands. An Allied operation that would have gone off this week is Operation Satin in North Africa. I say would have because it was nixed by the Joint Chiefs last week at Casablanca, and there will be no Allied drive to the sea to split the Axis positions until Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army is in Tunisia and can provide support. There will be raids to hopefully keep the enemy off balance until the weather improves enough for a coordinated offensive operation. Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower lays this out the 18th. But German attacks begin that very same day. See, they already control the mountain passes in the north that lead to Bizerta and Tunis. They are now attempting to capture the 4 main passes through the high ground in central and southern Tunisia. Control of the passes would enlarge the Axis bridgehead and safeguard the coastal corridor linking Arnim's 5th Panzer Army and Rommel's troops, who were closing into Tunisia from Libya. It would also guarantee Tunis's water supply, a reservoir 40 miles south of Mejez El Bab, and keep the initiative in the Axis camp. Local Luftwaffe boss Smiling Albert Kesselring thinks they can drive the Allies back the way they came out of Tunisia, but to do so, they need to hold the eastern dorsal. So on the 18th, 50 German tanks make a diversionary feint against the British in the north, and then 5,000 infantry and the new Tiger tanks hit the French at the reservoir. This is the first use of Tigers here, and the Allies do not have anything that can stand against them on even terms. They easily take the Useltia Valley and the pass that controls the approach to Kairouan. The Americans attack the valley the 21st, loaded with tanks of their own, and the fighting is inconclusive as the week ends. And speaking of Rommel's troops closing in on Tunisia, on the 22nd, the Axis pull out of Tripoli after destroying many port installations. There is more to say about the Casablanca conference today, though. I talked about some of the leaders' thoughts on future operations last week, and we'll go over these strategic priorities next week, but I'd like to mention one of them today. The Casablanca Directive issued to British and American strategic bombing forces by the Joint Chiefs that is about the priorities for future bombing attacks. Most of the reasoning is in line with the precision bombing ideas of the American leaders. As yet, the U.S. Air Forces have too few resources to carry out the full scheme, and RAF Bomber Command as a whole is not able to attack with enough accuracy. The RAF Command will continue its area of bombing policy in line with the views of its Commander-in-Chief, Sir Arthur Harris. As Gerhard Weinberg adds to that, a major bombing offensive was to go forward, with the Americans free to try to carry it out in daylight as they insisted was feasible and the British were certain was not. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt actually send a telegram to Joseph Stalin partly about the aerial campaign, and that reads, "We believe an increased tempo will lead to greatly increased material and morale damage in Germany and rapidly deplete German fighter strength. We are already containing more than half the German Air Force in Western Europe and the Mediterranean. We have no doubt our intensified and diversified bombing offensive will compel further withdrawals of German air and other forces from the Russian front." More on the conference, its decisions, and its announcements to the public next week when the conference concludes. For this episode is just about to conclude itself with a few notes to end the week. On the 16th and 17th, the RAF bombs Berlin. On the 16th, Iraq declares war on the Axis powers. And this, the Germans stopped their daily deportations of those to be murdered from Warsaw to Treblinka a few months ago. But on January 18th, a German unit enters Warsaw to start that up again. 600 Jews are killed in the streets, and some 6,000 deported. But as the deportations go on, a small group of Jews who have managed to acquire small arms open fire on the Germans, killing several of them. The Germans fire back with machine guns, of course, but for the first time since the occupation, we saw Germans clinging to walls, crawling on the ground, running for cover, hesitation before taking a step in the fear of being hit by a Jewish bullet. The cries of the wounded Germans caused us joy and increased our thirst for battle. There is more fighting over the next few days. The Germans throwing grenades into the buildings of the resistors, killing hundreds of them, but the Jews take weapons from fallen Germans. And though only 12 Germans are killed, the German units withdraw from the city for the time being. You can learn more about all of this and much more about that side of the war in our War Against Humanity series that comes out twice a month right here on this channel. And that brings me to the end of a busy week of the war, with Velikie Luki finally falling, Stalingrad still holding out, the Soviets on the move in a bunch of places, the best Japanese defense on Guadalcanal falling, Sanananda falling on New Guinea, and the Allies still meeting to determine their future conduct of the war. And something else from the Axis side. Erich von Manstein commands the fairly new army group Dawn that tried and failed to relieve the Axis forces in Stalingrad last month. He has been frustrated by Adolf Hitler's orders and counter-orders to his military commanders. Today, Manstein sends what he calls a semi-official message to Kurt Zeitzler, Army Chief of Staff. It is an eyes-only message that begins with a general and blunt appraisal of the current situation in the USSR. It seems that Manstein wishes for Zeitzler to use this to convince Hitler to rethink his decision-making and his interfering in the conduct of the war. Manstein says that if Hitler does not alter his hands-on leadership, his meddling in military affairs, it will lead to certain defeat. It prevents military leaders from any effective operational command. So if they want to defeat the Soviet Union, Hitler absolutely must listen to his experienced military advisors. There is no evidence that Zeitzler ever passes along Manstein's thoughts to Adolf Hitler. On the War Against Humanity series, we did an episode on strategic bombing. Well, on the beginnings of the Allied strategic bombing campaign. And you can check that one out right here. And here are our most recent commissioned officers in the Time Ghost Army. And our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Diego Mendoza. My name is Diego Mendoza. You killed my father? Prepare to die. It is wonderful people like Diego Mendoza and Inigo Montoya. I'm just going to pretend he's in the army. And all of the rest of the Time Ghost army that finances all of these episodes and these series and our special episodes and everything. So join the army for more stuff at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.